That cold December morning in 2023, the courthouse didn't just hold people. It held tension so heavy it seemed to bend the air. Outside, the streets of downtown Chicago glimmered beneath a thin sheet of ice, the kind that made the city look still and fragile. Inside, the marble corridors echoed with footsteps and low murmurs, carrying the weight of something that no one could yet name. Even the officers posted at the courtroom doors could sense it, the subtle hum that runs through the air before lightning strikes. In courtroom 7, the crowd waited in uneasy silence, their winter coats draped across their laps, their eyes shifting between the defendant's table and the bench. The air smelled faintly of polish and cold air, sterile, sharp, unfeeling. And then, through the double doors, she appeared. Judge Margaret Thornfield, 39 years old, rolled herself into the room in her wheelchair, her back straight, her jaw set, her auburn hair pulled into the same severe bun she'd worn every day since the accident 3 years earlier. The bailiff's voice carried through the air, steady but strangely subdued. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Thornfield." They stood. They always did. But the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The call to rise for a woman who no longer could. The sound of shuffling feet filled the courtroom, followed by the creak of seats as they sat again. Margaret's eyes, sharp, intelligent, and impossibly green, swept across the room, absorbing everything at once. The faces of the jury, the attorneys at their tables, the defendant sitting motionless, his hands folded tightly on the wood before him. She had presided over hundreds of trials, each one a battle between fact and emotion, truth and perception. But today, something inside her felt unsettled. The air in courtroom 7 seemed alive, charged with something unseen, and it wasn't just the case. It was him. Thomas Mitchell, 34, construction worker, father, widower, now defendant. He sat with the stiffness of a man trying to contain the tremor in his hands. His once strong frame had withered, his blue shirt, pressed carefully by his mother that morning, hanging loosely on his shoulders. The deep lines on his face spoke of sleepless nights, hard labor, and the kind of pain that wears away at a man until only duty remains. But his eyes held something defiant, not anger, not fear, but love, the kind that burns quietly, unshakable and absolute. To the left, District Attorney Robert Hayes stood reviewing his notes, every line of his suit perfectly pressed, his expression carved from stone. He was known for his precision, a man who worshipped the letter of the law. His cases were clean, efficient, unemotional. Today would be no different. At least that's what he believed. Across from him, David Chen, the young public defender, looked barely older than a law student. His tie was slightly crooked, his papers trembling. In his hands, as he pretended to organize them. He was fighting uphill before the trial even began. The state versus a desperate man, a courtroom already half convinced of guilt. But it wasn't the lawyers who caught Margaret's attention. It was the small figure sitting in the front row behind the defense table, the kind of sight that made the whole room forget itself for a heartbeat. Emma Mitchell, 5 years old, blonde curls like sunlight caught in motion, eyes as blue as open sky. She sat with her grandmother beside her, tiny hands wrapped around a threadbare teddy bear missing one button eye. She didn't fidget. She didn't cry. She simply watched her father, silent and unblinking, her gaze too calm, too old, too knowing for a child her age. Margaret felt a strange pull, the kind of quiet recognition that slips beneath logic. There was something about that little girl, a serenity, a presence. It wasn't pity that rose inside her. It was wonder. The courtroom was full, but no one spoke above a whisper. Even the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer that morning, their hum drowned beneath the faint scratching of a reporter's pen in the corner. Margaret adjusted the papers before her, but her mind wasn't on the ink. It was on the contradictions, the way law demanded order, and yet humanity so often refused to fit into its boxes. The bailiff cleared his throat, reading from the formal statement. State versus Thomas Mitchell. Defendant is charged with armed robbery in the first degree in violation of... His words faded as Margaret's mind turned inward. Armed robbery. The phrase felt wrong, sterile, detached from the truth. She had read the file twice. The footage showed a man entering a pharmacy, taking insulin and children's medication, leaving behind exactly 1837s. No cash drawer emptied, no threats, no harm. Only a desperate act by a father on a freezing night. The law called it theft, but every line of that report read like a prayer. Thomas's leg, wrapped in a brace from an accident on site, jutted awkwardly beneath the table. His hands clenched together as if to stop himself from shaking. Margaret could feel the pain radiating off him, not just physical, but something deeper. The ache of a man who has failed to provide. She looked at him and saw not a criminal, but a man the world had forgotten to save. The DA rose first. Your Honor, the state is ready to proceed. His voice was clipped, practiced, merciless. The young defense attorney nodded stiffly. Ready, Your Honor. But before the gavel struck, before the first argument could be spoken, before Margaret could utter the words proceed, the air shifted. It began with the faint sound of fabric rustling, a small movement in the gallery, and then a voice. Small, clear, innocent. My daddy didn't do anything wrong. The words floated through the air, high and crystalline, cutting through the silence like sunlight through stained glass. Every head turned. The reporter stopped writing. The bailiff froze mid-step. Even Hayes, ever the embodiment of composure, faltered. Margaret's hand, resting on the edge of her desk, went still. She turned her gaze towards the sound and saw her, the little girl, standing now, clutching her teddy bear like armor, her chin trembling but her eyes unwavering. No one spoke. No one moved. The courtroom was no longer a room of law and evidence. It had become something else, a place where truth was no longer measured in documents and statutes, but in the fragile conviction of a child's voice. For a long moment, all Margaret could do was stare. Something deep within her chest stirred. Something she had buried beneath years of reason, logic, and pain. The words she had trained herself to live by, facts, law, evidence, suddenly felt small. That child's faith had cracked the foundation of everything she thought she knew. And in that suspended silence, as the echoes of that tiny voice faded into the wood and marble, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Because somewhere deep inside, every person in that room, from the bailiff to the jurors to the woman behind the bench, felt that this case was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about something far greater. And as Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, she realized she had just witnessed the first note of something impossible, the beginning of a miracle the law could never explain. They said he was a criminal. They called him a thief, a desperate man who crossed a line that no one should cross. But when he looked at his daughter, that small girl with the golden curls and wide, unshakable eyes, all anyone could see was a father. Not a danger, not a villain, just a man who had run out of ways to keep his promise. Before the arrest, before the headlines, before the courtroom that would hold its breath, Thomas Mitchell had been the kind of man everyone in town knew, not for his words, but for his work. He built things, houses, porches, fences, places where families lived out quiet dreams. He never made much, but what he did make, he earned with hands that never took more than they gave. His days began before dawn. The smell of coffee filled the small kitchen of their worn-down apartment. Emma would sit at the table with her cereal bowl and her teddy bear, watching her father lace up his boots. He always kissed her forehead before leaving, whispering the same line every morning. You keep smiling for me, sunshine. Daddy's got work to do. After losing his wife, Lena, during childbirth, Thomas's world had collapsed and rebuilt itself around one fragile purpose: raising Emma. There were nights when grief crawled through the walls, heavy and cold, but Emma's laughter kept pulling him back. Every bedtime was a ritual, her favorite part of the day. He would sit at the edge of her bed, his rough hands softened by the glow of her nightlight, and tell her stories. Always the same ones. About a healing princess who could mend anything. Broken toys, broken trees, broken hearts. Because she believed everything can be fixed, he'd say, smiling as Emma's eyelids fluttered. As long as you don't give up. And when she'd fall asleep, clutching her teddy, he'd whisper, "Good night, my miracle," before turning off the light. For years, that routine never changed, until the day the scaffolding collapsed. It was just another work site, another morning sky turning gold over steel beams and dust. He was halfway up a 2-story frame when the board beneath him split. He remembered the sound, sharp like a gunshot. And then the world tilted. The fall stole seconds he'd never get back. He woke up in a hospital bed, his right leg wrapped in steel and pain. The doctor's words cut deeper than the injury. "You'll walk again, but you won't climb roofs, not like before." The recovery drained what little savings he had. The insurance barely covered the surgery, and the bills multiplied like shadows. His tools gathered dust. Calls for work stopped coming. Rent slipped behind. Meals got smaller. But he never let Emma see the cracks. When she asked why he looked tired, he smiled and said, "Because I worked too hard fixing things." When she coughed at night, he told her it was just the weather. But her coughs grew sharper, deeper. The clinic visits turned into prescriptions he couldn't always fill. "Asthma," the doctor said. "She'll need regular treatment." Every visit ended with the same quiet humiliation, the pharmacist's polite voice saying, "You're short again, Mr. Mitchell." And every time, Thomas would nod, promise to come back, and walk out feeling smaller than before. By the end of November, his bills were a tower he couldn't climb. Disconnection notices, hospital payments, overdue rent. The landlord had already hinted at eviction. Emma's inhaler was almost empty. The nights were colder now. Her breathing grew ragged while she slept. Sometimes he'd sit beside her bed, counting the seconds between her breaths, praying she wouldn't stop. On the night that changed everything, snow drifted past their window like falling ash. Emma was asleep, her chest rising and falling unevenly. The medicine bottle on the counter was nearly empty. The pharmacy down the road was open 24 hours. Thomas sat at the table, head in his hands, the air heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and fear. He thought about every promise he'd ever made. To his wife, to his daughter, to himself. Promises were supposed to mean something. But what good were promises when your child couldn't breathe? He looked at the few crumpled bills in his wallet. $12. The prescription cost $52. He tried to tell himself he'd find another way in the morning, but then came a small sound from the bedroom. A wheeze so sharp it felt like it tore through the night. He couldn't wait anymore. He pulled on his jacket and boots, wrapped a blanket around Emma, and whispered, "I'll be right back, sunshine." She stirred, but didn't wake. The streets were nearly empty, the snow crunching beneath his steps. The neon pharmacy sign flickered red and white against the cold sky. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and artificial light. The clerk barely looked up. "I need this filled," he said, sliding the prescription across the counter. "That'll be $52.70, the clerk said, already turning away. Thomas's throat tightened. He looked down at his hands, at the 12 crumpled dollars. "I've got 12. My daughter. She can't—" "Sir," the clerk interrupted, his tone flat. "I can't help you if you can't pay." Something inside Thomas cracked. Not with anger, with despair. The kind that makes the world shrink until only one thing matters. He looked at the display of medicine behind the counter, then at the exit. His pulse thundered in his ears. He saw an object lying on the counter beside the register. His own utility knife, the one he'd been using to open boxes earlier that week. It wasn't even sharp anymore. He hadn't realized it was still in his jacket pocket. The clerk saw him reach for it and froze. Thomas didn't say a word. He didn't threaten, didn't shout. He just slid the knife across the counter and said quietly, "I just need the medicine. For my daughter." The clerk's hands shook as he placed 2 small boxes on the counter. Thomas set down every dollar he had, 12 crumpled bills and 37 cents. Then he turned and walked out. The snow swallowed his footsteps as he made his way home. By the time he reached the apartment, Emma was coughing again. He held her, whispering, "It's okay, baby, Daddy's here." He gave her the medicine, watched her breathing steady, and for the first time that night, he cried. When the police came 2 days later, he didn't resist. He only asked one question. Did she get her medicine? Now, sitting in that courtroom, Thomas's face was pale, his hands clasped tightly together. Across the room, Emma's small eyes never left him. The prosecutor walked toward the judge, holding a flash drive. "Your Honor," he said, "the state would like to submit Exhibit B, the pharmacy's security footage." Margaret nodded, her pulse slowing, bracing herself for what was to come. The lights dimmed. The footage flickered on the screen. Snow. A man in a blue jacket, a knife-shaped shadow in his hand, the clerk's trembling face, and then the camera zoomed in. The courtroom gasped, because what looked like a weapon wasn't a weapon at all. In that single frozen frame, the truth shimmered. The object wasn't a knife, but a broken plastic toy wrench, painted silver by a child's hand. Sometimes, even the smallest objects can change the course of a man's life. A coin, a photo, a child's toy. In courtroom 7, that truth hung heavy in the air as the flickering image on the screen revealed what everyone had mistaken for a weapon. It wasn't a gun. It wasn't even metal. It was pink. A small plastic water pistol, the kind you could buy for $1 at a summer fair. The camera caught the faint glimmer of its bubblegum color beneath the pharmacy's harsh fluorescent lights. The courtroom collectively inhaled, the silence breaking into murmurs of disbelief that rolled like a wave through the gallery. Judge Margaret Thornfield leaned forward, her green eyes narrowing as the footage played again in slow motion. The object in Thomas's trembling hand reflected not the cold shine of steel, but the soft, glossy hue of a child's forgotten toy. District Attorney Robert Hayes adjusted his tie, his voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "Your Honor, regardless of its appearance, the defendant entered a place of business with an object resembling a firearm. The law—" Margaret raised her hand slightly. "We'll get to the law, Mr. Hayes. For now, let's get to the truth." Thomas sat motionless, his head bowed, the veins in his hands pronounced beneath pale skin. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, in a voice roughened by exhaustion and regret, he said, "It wasn't supposed to scare anyone." His lawyer, David Chen, a young man barely out of law school, nodded encouragingly. "Tell the court what happened that night, Thomas. In your own words." Thomas's fingers fidgeted against the edge of the table. "That toy." He paused, exhaling shakily. "That toy belonged to my daughter, Emma. She used to play with it every summer. She'd chase the neighborhood kids with it, pretending she was some kind of water warrior princess." His lips trembled at the memory, a faint, broken smile flickering and fading. "That night, when she couldn't breathe, I panicked. I grabbed my jacket, my wallet, her prescription, and ran. I didn't even realize until I got there that her toy was still in the pocket." He swallowed hard, his eyes wet. "When the pharmacist said no, that I didn't have enough, I just wanted him to listen, to see how desperate I was. I pulled it out because I thought he'd take me seriously if he thought I wasn't leaving without that medicine." He looked up, meeting Margaret's gaze for the first time. "But I swear I never meant to scare anyone. I never meant to hurt anyone. I just—" His voice cracked. "I just wanted my little girl to breathe again." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the old ceiling fan. Hayes stood again, unshaken. "Your Honor, the law doesn't bend for desperation. Intent does not erase the act. Whether it was a gun, a knife, or a child's toy, the defendant created fear, and fear has consequences." Margaret studied him, her expression unreadable. "So you're saying, compassion has no place in justice, Mr. Hayes?" "The law is compassion," Hayes replied firmly. "It protects those who might be harmed, even by someone else's good intentions." David Chen rose from his seat, his voice steadier than before. "With respect, Your Honor, sometimes desperation is humanity's purest truth. When the system fails a man so completely that he has to choose between obeying the law and saving his child, the law should ask not just what he did, but why he did it." He stepped forward, glancing at the jury. "You've all been afraid before. You've all loved someone enough to do something you never thought you would. That's not criminal. That's human." The jury listened, their faces conflicted, torn between reason and empathy. Margaret felt it too, that tug-of-war between law and life. She'd spent years hiding behind logic because it was safer than feeling. But now, watching Thomas's trembling hands, hearing the tremor in his voice, she felt something shifting. At the defense table, Thomas closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about freedom. He wasn't thinking about verdicts. He was thinking about Emma, about the sound of her laughter, the smell of her strawberry shampoo, the way she'd fall asleep mid-story with her hand still resting on his arm. He whispered, almost to himself, "She calls me her hero." David placed a hand on his shoulder. "She still will." From the front row, Emma Mitchell watched everything with a focus that made her grandmother uneasy. The little girl's blue eyes flickered from her father to the judge, then to the screen still frozen on that image of her pink water gun. She hugged her teddy bear tightly, her thumb brushing over its frayed fur as if drawing courage from it. She didn't understand all the words being thrown around. Felony, intent, sentencing. But she understood sadness. She could feel it rolling off her father like heat. She could see it hiding behind the judge's calm face. Even the man in the shiny suit, the prosecutor, seemed tired when he wasn't talking. She leaned closer to her grandmother. "Grammy," she whispered, "why are they saying Daddy is bad?" Sarah Mitchell, her face lined with worry, pressed a trembling finger to her lips. "Shh, baby, the grown-ups are trying to fix it." Emma frowned. "They're not fixing it right." The session dragged on. Witnesses were called, testimony read, and still the pink toy gun sat on the evidence table under harsh light. A child's innocence transformed into an object of guilt. Every few minutes, Margaret's gaze drifted to it. Something about it felt symbolic. A small, ridiculous object that had somehow become the hinge between justice and mercy. When the recess was finally called, the courtroom exhaled. People rose, whispering, stretching, shaking their heads. Thomas remained seated, his eyes fixed on the toy gun. The bailiff approached to escort him back to the holding room, but he didn't move until Chen gently nudged him. Across the aisle, Emma slid off her bench and reached for her grandmother's hand. Her tiny shoes clicked softly on the floor as they walked toward the door. The child looked back once more. At her father, at the judge, at the toy that had caused so much pain. Sarah bent down to zip her coat. But before she could stand, Emma tugged at her sleeve. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried something calm and certain, something that didn't belong to a frightened child. "Grammy," she said, her blue eyes shining with quiet conviction. "I can fix this." Sarah froze, unsure whether to smile or cry. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing a curl from Emma's cheek. "I wish you could." But Emma only squeezed her hand tighter, her gaze locked on the judge's bench, as if she already knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. Because in that moment, small, still, and unseen, The first spark of something extraordinary began to flicker behind her innocent eyes. She had ruled on hundreds of cases, murders, thefts, betrayals, tragedies, each one sealed neatly behind her verdicts, her words, her unwavering authority. But this case was breaking something inside her, and she didn't know why. When Judge Margaret Thornfield looked down from her bench at the broken man sitting before her and the child who refused to give up on him, something deep in her chest began to stir. Something she had buried years ago. 3 years earlier, she had been unstoppable, brilliant, feared, admired, the youngest circuit court judge in the state, on track for the appellate bench before 40. Her life had been sharp and ordered, her confidence unshakable. Until one October night, when headlights came out of nowhere and shattered everything she thought she was. She remembered the crash in fragments, the screech of tires, the metallic scream of crushed steel, the taste of blood and rain. She remembered the silence after, the stillness that felt like death. When she woke up in the hospital, she couldn't feel her legs. A drunk driver had run a stop sign, walked away with a concussion, and left her with a lifetime sentence in a wheelchair. The months that followed were an endless blur of pain and recovery. Physical therapy became her new courtroom, brutal, repetitive, and humiliating. Every movement was a negotiation between mind and body, a reminder of everything she had lost. Her husband, Richard, had tried at first. He brought flowers, told jokes, made promises. But pity has a short half-life. One morning, he simply stopped coming. When he finally left, his goodbye was as quiet as his absence, a folded note on the kitchen counter. "I can't live in this kind of silence." She hadn't cried. Not then. Instead, she built walls, discipline, poise, control, the armor she needed to survive. When she returned to the bench, she did so with a steel smile and a colder heart. People admired her resilience. No one noticed the distance behind her eyes. Now, in the cold, fluorescent light of courtroom 7, that armor was beginning to crack. She sat in her chambers during the afternoon recess, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Outside, snow fell in slow, drifting patterns, white against the gray skyline. The courthouse clock ticked faintly in the background, steady, unfeeling. Her wheelchair creaked slightly as she leaned forward, elbows on the desk. She could still hear the echo of the morning session. Thomas's trembling confession, the defense attorney's plea for humanity, the child's voice saying, "My daddy didn't do anything wrong." She'd heard countless pleas over the years, each one a variation of the same melody. Desperation, denial, hope. But Emma's voice had been different. It wasn't begging. It wasn't bargaining. It was belief. Pure, unfiltered belief in the goodness of someone the world had already condemned. Margaret reached for a photograph on her desk, one she rarely looked at anymore. It showed her before the crash, standing in her robe, tall and certain, the world still hers to command. That version of herself felt like another person now, a ghost she couldn't quite remember being. The knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said. Marcus Rodriguez, her physical therapist, stepped inside. He still wore the same calm expression he always did, the kind of face that didn't flinch when others did. A former Marine who had lost his leg in Afghanistan, Marcus had spent years teaching people like her how to rebuild themselves from pieces. "Rough day?" he asked gently, setting a file on her desk. "You could say that," she replied, her voice steady but distant. "A man on trial for stealing medicine for his daughter, a prosecutor quoting statutes, a defense attorney quoting mercy, and a 5-year-old quoting faith." Marcus smiled faintly. "And which one do you believe?" "I believe in the law," she said automatically. Then, softer, "At least I used to." Marcus studied her. "You've always known the law, Margaret, but sometimes justice isn't written down in books." She looked up at him sharply. Justice without law is chaos, and law without compassion is cold, he countered. I've seen people fight harder for life after losing everything than those who had it all. You're one of them. You're stronger than you think. The words landed somewhere deep inside her, stirring an ache she hadn't felt in years. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that strength was still there, that she hadn't just learned to survive, but to live. After he left, she sat for a long time in silence. Her hands drifted over the wooden arms of her chair, the only throne she had left. She had spent years commanding others to stand when she could not. Years convincing the world she was unbroken, when every night she dreamed of running again. Her gaze fell to the case file still open on her desk. The crime scene photo of Thomas's trembling hands, the pink toy gun beside the medicine bottles. And then a smaller image, the police body cam still that showed Emma in her pajamas, clutching her teddy bear, asking, "Can Daddy come home now?" Something inside her shifted. The law demanded punishment. But her heart whispered something else. Something older, something human. Maybe justice wasn't always about right and wrong. Maybe, sometimes, it was about love and loss, about how far people would go to protect the only thing they had left. For the first time in years, Margaret felt tears blur her vision. They startled her, like a part of her body remembering how to work again after too long a sleep. She brushed them away quickly, angry at her own weakness. But even as she composed herself, she couldn't shake the image of that little girl. Those eyes, that voice, that impossible faith. Emma hadn't just believed in her father. She'd believed in something bigger. And for reasons Margaret couldn't explain, that belief was starting to wake something in her, too. Something she thought had died the night of the crash. Hope. It was terrifying. She was still staring at the falling snow when a knock echoed from the outer office. Her assistant's voice came through the door. "Judge Thornfield, there's a little girl here who says she needs to speak with you." Margaret froze. The words hung in the air like a ripple in still water. A little girl. Her heart skipped once, sharp and sudden. She turned slowly toward the door, her voice barely steady. "Send her in." Rules said she should send the girl away. Protocol, boundaries, procedure. Those were the invisible walls that held the world of justice together. But when the bailiff hesitated in the doorway and said, "Judge Thornfield, there's a little girl here who says she needs to speak with you," something in Margaret's chest shifted, a quiet, almost imperceptible thaw. "Send her in," she said before she could stop herself. The door opened slowly, and in stepped Emma Mitchell, small, composed, impossibly calm for a 5-year-old. She wore a faded blue dress patterned with tiny white flowers and clutched a worn teddy bear to her chest. Her blonde curls caught the light from the window, glowing like a halo against the gray tones of the judge's chambers. She didn't fidget, didn't stumble. She simply stood there, her little shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor, and looked at the judge with eyes too wise for her years. Margaret blinked, momentarily unsure how to address her. "You know, sweetheart, you're not supposed to be back here," she said softly, trying to maintain her judicial tone. "These chambers are for court officials only." Emma nodded solemnly. "I know, but you're the judge lady, and you need to know something about my daddy." Margaret felt the faintest tug at the corner of her mouth. "Judge lady?" "That's what I call you," Emma replied matter-of-factly, as though it were her official title. "Because you wear the robe, and everyone listens when you talk." Margaret leaned back slightly in her wheelchair, studying the child. "All right then, Miss Mitchell. What is it that you need to tell me about your father?" Emma's small fingers traced the frayed seam of her teddy bear's arm. "He's not a bad person," she said, her voice clear but soft, as if she was afraid of making the truth sound too loud. "He just gets scared sometimes, but when I'm scared, he tells me stories. That's how I know he's brave." Margaret tilted her head. "Stories?" "About the princess," Emma said, her eyes lighting up for the first time. "The one who can heal people. She has magic in her hands, but she only uses it when it's really, really important. Daddy says her magic comes from love. That's what makes it strong." Margaret swallowed hard, feeling something stir, an ache that had nothing to do with her legs. "That's a beautiful story," she murmured. Emma stepped closer, her shoes clicking softly against the marble. "He never forgets to tell it. Even when his leg hurts, he still sits by my bed. Sometimes he falls asleep in the chair, but I know he's there. He always is." The judge tried to speak, but her voice caught somewhere in her throat. She had presided over enough cases to know that words like these, innocent, unfiltered, often carried more truth than any sworn testimony. Emma tilted her head, studying her with quiet curiosity. "You look sad, Judge Lady," she said suddenly. Margaret blinked. "Sad?" "Uh-huh." Emma nodded with certainty. "Like you need someone to tell you stories, too. Maybe a bedtime one. Or maybe you just need someone to hold your hand when you're scared." The words hit her like a blow she hadn't braced for. For a moment, Margaret couldn't breathe. This small child, this little girl who should have been frightened or nervous, had seen straight through her. "I don't get scared," Margaret said finally, though even she could hear the unsteadiness in her voice. Emma just smiled, not believing her for a second. "That's okay. Grown-ups say that a lot." The silence that followed was soft but full, the kind of silence that pressed against the heart rather than the ears. Margaret looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Hands that had once been her tools of authority, steady and controlled. But now, under the gaze of this child, they trembled slightly. "You love your father very much," she said, more to fill the silence than anything else. Emma's eyes brightened. "More than ice cream, more than stories, more than everything." She paused, then added with simple conviction, "And he loves me more than the world. That's why he did what he did, because love makes people brave, even when it makes them do scary things." Margaret's composure slipped. She felt something inside her crack, not a sharp break, but a quiet splitting, like a frozen lake beneath the first touch of spring. For years, she had hidden behind reason, behind the law, behind the comforting armor of detachment. But now, with a child standing in front of her, speaking of love and bravery and bedtime stories, those walls were crumbling. "Emma," she said softly, "you shouldn't be here. What we're talking about, it's complicated. Grown-up things." Emma's little chin lifted, the gesture startlingly confident. "I know. But grown-ups make things too hard. You forgot how to believe in miracles." Margaret froze. "What did you say?" Emma's expression softened, almost pitying. "Miracles. You know, the things that happen when you don't think they can, but then they do because somebody believes really, really hard." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I think you used to believe in them. Before something bad happened." For the first time in a very long time, Margaret felt the sting of tears. Not the kind born of pain, but the kind that come when someone speaks a truth you've spent years trying not to hear. She turned away, pretending to straighten a file on her desk. "You're a very wise little girl," she murmured. "I'm not wise," Emma said simply. "I just listen. People say things with their hearts before they say them with their mouths. You just have to pay attention." Margaret looked back at her. Really looked at her. There was something unexplainable about the child. A calmness, a knowing, as though she carried something larger than herself, something the world had stopped recognizing a long time ago. "Emma," she said finally, her voice low and sincere, "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure your father gets a fair chance. I promise you that." Emma smiled, clutching her teddy bear a little tighter. "I know you will, because you still have love inside you, even if you forgot where you put it." The judge let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You'd better get back to your grandmother before she worries." Emma nodded, her curls bouncing as she turned toward the door. But before she left, she paused and looked back. "Judge Lady?" "Yes?" Emma smiled, her voice light but full of something deeper. something that didn't belong to a child. "Don't worry, I can fix this." And then she was gone, leaving behind a silence that hummed with the faint echo of faith, the kind Margaret hadn't felt since before the accident. When the courtroom reconvened that afternoon, everyone noticed it. Emma's seat in the front row seemed to glow with quiet certainty. Her tiny hands rested calmly in her lap, her blue eyes steady, knowing. And as the bailiff called the court back to order, a strange hush fell over the room, because even though no one could explain it, everyone could feel it. Something was about to happen, something no law book could ever contain. Justice was supposed to be blind. But that day, even justice began to see. The courtroom was packed to the rafters when the afternoon session began. The hum of whispered conversations faded as Judge Margaret Thornfield rolled into her place behind the bench, her expression unreadable, her heart anything but calm. The air was thick, not with tension this time, but with something else, something fragile, something alive. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Each one painted a piece of the picture, not of a crime, but of a life unraveling. The first was Michael Peterson, the pharmacist. His voice trembled as he adjusted his glasses, the weight of his guilt settling on his shoulders. "I've been robbed before," he said, his tone soft, full of regret. "But that night wasn't like the others. He didn't yell, didn't threaten me. He was polite, desperate. He told me his little girl couldn't breathe. I saw the tears in his eyes. I wanted to help him, I swear I did." He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But company policy doesn't leave room for mercy. I had to call it in. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I haven't slept a full night since." A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Next came Sarah Mitchell, Thomas's mother. She gripped the witness rail with both hands, her knuckles pale, her voice steady despite the tears streaking her face. "My son has never been a criminal," she said. "He's a man who worked himself to the bone to raise his daughter after her mother died. He sold his tools, his truck, even his wedding ring just to keep food on the table. But love doesn't fill inhalers. Love doesn't pay hospital bills. And when you have a child gasping for air in the middle of the night, you don't think about the law. You think about breathing." Her voice broke, and she pressed a shaking hand to her chest. "He didn't steal out of greed. He stole out of love." The prosecutor, Robert Hayes, stood. His crisp suit gleamed under the lights, his voice precise and controlled. "Mrs. Mitchell, with respect, the law cannot bend to emotion. If everyone acted based on love or desperation, chaos would follow." Sarah turned her gaze to him, sharp and unyielding despite the tears. "Then maybe the law needs to remember who it's supposed to serve." The silence that followed her words carried more power than any gavel. Margaret sat straighter in her chair, feeling something twist inside her. Every word spoken was dismantling the neat order she had built her life upon. Every testimony was pulling her further from the safety of procedure and deeper into something raw and human. Then came Dr. Emily Rodriguez, Emma's pediatrician. Her voice was calm, clinical, but her eyes betrayed compassion. "Emma's condition is severe," she said. "Asthma like hers can turn fatal within minutes if untreated. The night in question, without access to medication, her chances of survival were slim." The jurors shifted uncomfortably. Even the court reporter slowed her typing, as if unwilling to break the gravity of what hung in the air. When Dr. Rodriguez stepped down, the courtroom felt heavier, burdened by the truth that Thomas's so-called crime had likely saved a life. The prosecutor stood again, pushing back against the growing tide of sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the law is not about feelings. It is about order. The moment we excuse crimes based on emotion, we lose the foundation that holds society together. Mr. Mitchell may be a loving father, but love cannot justify lawlessness." His words rang hollow. Even he seemed to hear it. Then David Chen, the young defense attorney, rose from his seat. His hands trembled as he adjusted his notes. But when he spoke, His voice carried the conviction of someone who still believed in the good fight. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, "the prosecution is right about one thing. The law must protect us. But what happens when the law forgets compassion? When rules matter more than lives? We tell ourselves that justice is blind, but today, maybe just today, it needs to open its eyes." He turned, gesturing toward Thomas, who sat silently at the defense table, his head bowed. This man didn't act out of greed. He didn't act for gain. He acted because love left him no other choice. And maybe, just maybe, that's the purest truth there is. The words hung in the still air, vibrating through every heart in the room. Thomas lifted his gaze toward the judge's bench, his eyes meeting Margaret's. She held the stare longer than she should have. There was something in those eyes, not defiance, not fear, but surrender. The look of a man who had already made peace with his fate as long as his child lived. Margaret's fingers tightened around the wooden arms of her chair. She had seen criminals plead for mercy before. But this wasn't that. This was something deeper, a plea that came not from guilt, but from love. And love was not something she knew how to sentence. Her oath bound her to the law. Her heart whispered otherwise. The two halves of her, judge and woman, were at war, and for the first time, she didn't know which one was right. The gavel rested by her hand, cold and heavy. She stared at it, thinking how simple it would be to strike it down and hide behind procedure. But a voice echoed in her memory, a child's voice, bright and sure. "You forgot how to believe in miracles." Margaret blinked away the thought, straightened in her seat, and cleared her throat. "The court will take a brief recess." As she said the words, a murmur of movement rippled through the room. Chairs scraped, whispers returned, the spell of the trial temporarily broken. The bailiffs guided the jurors toward the lounge. Thomas leaned forward, whispering something to his attorney, who nodded quietly. Margaret exhaled, her heart pounding. She needed a moment to think, to breathe. But fate didn't give her that luxury. Because just as she began to turn toward her chambers, a small sound rose above the noise, clear, light, unmistakable. "Judge Lady?" Every head turned. Emma stood in the front row, her small figure illuminated by the courtroom light. Her teddy bear hung from one hand. Her face was calm, almost serene. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but Emma beat her to it. Her voice carried through the silent courtroom with a clarity that no one expected. "Let my daddy go free," she said softly, "and I'll make you walk again." The words struck like thunder. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The gallery froze. The bailiffs stared, and even the court reporter's hands hovered motionless above the keys. Judge Margaret Thornfield, a woman who prided herself on her composure, felt her pulse stop cold. The child's gaze met hers, calm, steady, certain. And in that impossible silence, for the first time in 3 years, Margaret felt something stir in her legs, a faint, electric tremor, like the whisper of a miracle waiting to begin. For a long, impossible moment, the world stopped turning. The courtroom, so full of arguments, logic, and law, fell into a silence so absolute that even the hum of the lights seemed to disappear. All eyes were on the small figure in the front row. Emma Mitchell, standing beside her grandmother with her teddy bear hanging from one hand and conviction glowing in her blue eyes. "Let my daddy go free," she repeated softly, "and I'll make you walk again." Her voice was calm, pure, and impossibly certain. The gallery collectively exhaled, gasping in disbelief. One of the jurors covered her mouth. Another crossed himself instinctively. Even the bailiffs, trained to maintain composure in every situation, exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Margaret Thornfield sat frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her fingers gripped the edges of her wheelchair. The words seemed to echo around the chamber, wrapping around her like a whisper she couldn't escape. Sweetheart? Margaret's voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. You can't say things like that. You don't understand what you're— District Attorney Hayes shot to his feet, red-faced, outrage pouring from him like a storm. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate, he barked, slamming his hands on the table. This child is making a mockery of these proceedings. The court cannot entertain— Sit down, Mr. Hayes, Margaret said sharply. But her voice lacked its usual authority. It was softer, wondering, searching. Your Honor, Hayes persisted, the defendant's daughter cannot— I said sit down, she repeated, louder this time, though even she didn't know why. The room fell still again. Emma turned toward the angry man in the shiny suit, her small brow furrowed. I'm not making a deal, she said, her voice unshaken. I'm making a promise. Hayes scoffed. A promise? Yes, Emma said, looking up at him with eyes that held too much calm for a 5-year-old. Because promises come from love. And love is the strongest magic there is. Her words, simple as they were, seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, like a bell's last note echoing through a cathedral. Margaret leaned forward, her breath caught halfway between disbelief and something else. Hope, maybe, though she didn't dare name it. Emma, she said gently, you can't make promises like that. Miracles don't— The little girl didn't let her finish. Yes, they do. You just stopped believing. A few people in the gallery gasped softly. Others frowned, shifting uncomfortably. But Emma didn't seem to notice. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the woman behind the bench. You used to believe, she said, her voice almost whispering now, before someone hurt you. Before you forgot how to see magic. Margaret's throat tightened. No one in the room knew about the accident, at least not in detail. No one knew about the nights she spent alone, staring at her unresponsive legs, wondering if this was all life would ever be. But somehow, this child knew. Emma, Thomas said weakly from the defense table, his voice cracking. Baby, please, stop. You don't have to do this. The little girl turned toward her father, her expression full of warmth. It's okay, Daddy. You told me stories about the princess who could heal people. Remember? I think maybe you were talking about me. Thomas's lips parted, but no sound came. The courtroom was still as a held breath. Hayes, recovering from his shock, slammed his palm on the table again. Your Honor, this is absurd. We are wasting the court's time with childish fantasies. Emma's eyes flicked toward him again, not with anger, but with quiet sadness. You don't believe because you forgot what it feels like to love someone more than yourself. The words hit Hayes like a physical blow. He froze, his mouth half open, color draining from his face. Then, slowly, Emma turned back toward the judge. You don't have to believe in me, Judge Lady. You just have to believe in love. She reached into her small pocket and pulled out something crushed and fragile, a wilted daisy, brown at the edges, its stem bent. It looked as lifeless as the hope that had long since left Margaret's heart. Emma cradled the flower gently between her palms, closing her eyes. Daddy says when you love something enough, she whispered, you can make it whole again. The entire room seemed to lean forward. The sound of the air, conditioner, the shuffle of papers, even the faint creak of benches, all faded into a single collective silence. Margaret's eyes widened as she watched. The child opened her hands. Before their eyes, the daisy began to change. Its petals unfurled slowly, the brown fading into white, the stem straightening with a shimmer of green. It wasn't a trick of light or imagination. It was alive, fresh, bright, radiant, like something born again from pure belief. Gasps erupted from the courtroom. Someone dropped their notepad. The stenographer froze mid-keystroke. Dr. Rodriguez, seated quietly in the back, leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. That's impossible. Emma smiled softly, holding out the flower toward Margaret. See, she said simply. Love fixes things. Margaret couldn't move. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her mind screamed, "No, no, this couldn't be real, couldn't possibly be real." But her eyes said otherwise. The daisy was perfect, vibrant, alive. The law didn't account for miracles. Evidence, precedent, logic, those were her pillars. But now, sitting in that courtroom, with this impossible flower glowing in a child's hand, all of it felt suddenly fragile. The prosecutor was pale. The defense attorney looked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. The jury was motionless, caught between fear and awe. Only Emma stood steady, the faintest smile on her lips, her small hands still cupped around the flower as if guarding something sacred. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "This," she swallowed hard, "this can't be real." But even as the words left her lips, the daisy in Emma's hand pulsed with light. And somewhere deep inside her, Margaret felt the faintest flicker of warmth in the legs she hadn't felt in 3 long years. Every law in the world broke that afternoon. And nobody cared. The courtroom, once a place of cold reason and rigid decorum, had turned into something sacred. The air shimmered with disbelief and trembling hope, as if the very walls could feel that something extraordinary was happening. The daisy in Emma's small hand gleamed faintly under the pale light from the high windows, its petals open, alive, a quiet rebellion against everything logic had built. No one spoke. Not the attorneys. Not the jury. Not even Judge Margaret Thornfield, whose hands rested motionless on the polished oak of her bench. Only the soft, steady rhythm of Emma's small shoes against the marble floor broke the silence as she began to walk, step by careful step, towards the bench. Her grandmother tried to reach for her, whispering her name in warning, but Emma didn't stop. She climbed the 2 short steps up to the raised platform, the flower still cupped in her hand, her eyes fixed on the woman who had spent 3 years sitting above the world, yet feeling so far beneath it. When she reached the bench, she looked up at the judge with a calm that seemed too deep for someone her age. "Judge lady," she said softly, "do you believe me now?" Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her throat was dry, her heart thudding so hard it felt like it might burst through her chest. She began, but her voice cracked, the sound fragile, human, uncertain. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Emma tilted her head, smiling faintly. "That's okay. You don't have to understand. You just have to feel it." She lifted the daisy, the impossible, living daisy, and held it out toward the bench. The light caught on its petals, casting soft reflections across the polished surface between them. "Love doesn't follow rules, Judge Lady," Emma said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Love just is." Margaret stared at the flower, its delicate stem trembling in the girl's fingers. "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you?" The little girl smiled wider, her blue eyes glimmering. "Just someone who still believes." The courtroom was utterly silent now. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached forward, hesitating inches from the daisy. She wanted to pull back, to retreat into logic, into the comfort of the law, into the safety of doubt. But something in Emma's gaze anchored her there. Slowly she extended her hand. Her fingertips brushed the flower's petals. Warmth. Soft at first, like the gentle touch of sunlight after years of darkness. Then stronger, spreading from her fingertips up her arm, flowing through her chest, down, lower, to the place she had stopped believing in. Margaret gasped. Her hand jerked back. Her eyes widened as the warmth turned to a tingling pulse, like tiny sparks flickering beneath her skin. I felt that," she whispered, almost to herself. The defense attorney blinked, leaning forward. The prosecutor froze mid-step. A juror's hand flew to her mouth. Emma's expression didn't change. She just watched quietly, as though this was the most natural thing in the world. "It's okay," she said softly. "It's supposed to feel warm." That's how love works. It wakes things up. Margaret's heart raced. The tingling grew stronger, alive and electric, crawling down her body in waves until it reached the place that had been numb for so long, her legs. For 3 years, they had been nothing more than memory. Cold, lifeless things she had learned to move around but never feel. But now, she clutched the edge of the bench, her knuckles white, tears stinging her eyes. "What's happening?" she whispered. Emma took another small step forward, setting the daisy gently on the bench between them. "You're remembering," she said simply. "You just forgot what it felt like to believe." The judge stared at her. This child, this impossible little girl who spoke with the certainty of someone who knew more than the world itself. In the gallery, the crowd began to stir, not in panic, but in awe. One woman clasped her hands together and began to cry. The court reporter's eyes were glistening. Even the bailiff, a mountain of a man, seemed to wipe discreetly at the corner of his eye. Margaret wanted to tell herself it wasn't real, that her mind was playing tricks on her, that this was nothing more than emotion taking physical form. But the warmth spreading through her wasn't imagined. It was there, tangible, alive. Her chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths. "Emma," she said again, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. Why me?" The little girl's answer was simple. "Because you forgot how to feel hope, and when grown-ups forget, sometimes someone small has to remind them." Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. Her vision blurred as tears gathered, spilling down her cheeks. She looked down at the daisy, alive, bright, defiant, and then back at the child who had brought it back to life. Something in her broke open then, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding shut. Years of anger, bitterness, loneliness, all of it began to fall away under the weight of that single moment. The warmth intensified. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she reached down, pressing her palms against her thighs. Something she hadn't done in years, not since the accident. And then she felt it, a faint pressure, a pulse, a whisper of life under her palms. Her breath caught, her eyes widened. "I can feel something," she whispered. The words came out barely audible at first, but the courtroom was so silent that even the sound of her breath felt loud. Emma smiled. "I told you, love fixes things." Margaret blinked, her lips trembling. "For the first time in 3 years..." She paused, emotion catching in her throat as her voice cracked. "I can feel my legs." The words echoed through the courtroom like a prayer answered. Gasps, cries, a single sound of disbelief turned into a chorus of awe. People stood, tears running freely, hands covering mouths. Even the prosecutor, the skeptic of all skeptics, sank slowly back into his chair, staring in stunned silence. Margaret stared down at her hands, at her trembling fingers resting against the legs she had long since mourned. The warmth radiated upward, filling her chest, her throat, her mind. It wasn't just sensation returning. It was faith. For the first time in years, she didn't feel broken. She felt whole. Her voice shook as she looked at the child still standing before her, haloed in the light streaming through the windows. "Emma," she whispered, tears glistening like sunlight. "What are you?" The child only smiled, lifting her eyes toward the ceiling. "I'm just love, Judge Lady," she said softly. "You just finally decided to see it." It began with a whisper and ended with the sound of a miracle. The courtroom, once a sanctuary for reason and rule, now pulsed with something holy. The daisy lay glowing on the bench like a living flame, and Judge Margaret Thornfield sat frozen, tears streaking her face as sensation bloomed through her legs for the first time in 3 years. Emma stood before her, small and sure, her golden curls haloed by afternoon light. Her voice came softly, but it carried to every corner of the room. "It's working," she said, "but it needs more love to finish." No one moved. No one even breathed. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Margaret whispered, her voice trembling between disbelief and longing. Emma turned toward the crowd, the jury, the lawyers, the onlookers who had come expecting a trial, and instead found themselves witnesses to something divine. "Everybody has to help," she said earnestly. "Love works best when everyone shares it." A hush fell so deep, it seemed the world itself was listening. Emma's eyes glistened with tears, but her tone was firm. "Close your eyes. Think about someone you love more than anything. Your mom, your baby, your friend. Think about how much you love them and send that love here. Send it to Judge Lady so she can remember how to walk." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. At first, no one dared. But then, slowly, one by one, people began to obey. Thomas Mitchell, still seated at the defense table, pressed a shaking hand to his heart, whispering a prayer. His mother, Sarah, closed her eyes, her lips moving soundlessly. The young defense attorney bowed his head. Even the prosecutor, Robert Hayes, who had built a career on facts and proof, found himself frozen, staring at the child before him with eyes that no longer knew what to disbelieve. And then something shifted. It began as a feeling, faint and delicate, like a breeze moving through the still air. The tension that had filled the courtroom melted into something warmer, softer. The energy changed. It was as if every heart in that room had synced to the same beat, pulsing together in rhythm. Emma lifted her small hands toward Margaret. "Do you feel it?" she asked softly. Margaret's chest heaved with sobs she didn't understand. The warmth in her legs grew stronger, spreading through her body until she could feel every inch of herself again. Her fingers trembled against the armrests of her wheelchair. "I can feel it," she whispered, her voice breaking. It's like fire and light all at once." The glow from the daisy seemed to deepen, as though responding to the love flooding the room. Tears streamed down faces on every bench. Someone began to quietly pray. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God!" Emma smiled through her own tears. "It's time, Judge Lady," she said softly. "It's time to stand." Margaret shook her head, breathless. "I can't. I haven't in—" "Yes, you can," Emma interrupted, stepping closer and placing both tiny hands over Margaret's knees. "You just forgot how." The warmth intensified until it became a hum, deep, vibrant, alive. Margaret gasped, gripping the bench as the sensation surged through her legs, muscles twitching, nerves reawakening after years of silence. Around her, the entire courtroom held its breath. And then, slowly, she began to rise. Her arms trembled with the effort, her face twisted in both pain and wonder, her knees buckled, caught, then steadied. The faint scrape of her shoes against the floor echoed like thunder in that sacred silence. And then, she was standing. For the first time since the night of the accident, Judge Margaret Thornfield stood on her own 2 feet. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman in the gallery sobbed aloud. A bailiff covered his mouth with his hand, tears spilling down his cheeks. The prosecutor dropped his pen and whispered, "Dear God." Margaret looked down, disbelieving, her body shaking as she stared at the ground that felt impossibly solid beneath her feet. "I'm standing," she breathed, her voice trembling. "I'm really standing." Emma looked up at her, smiling through her tears. "You didn't just stand," she whispered. "You remembered how to hope." Margaret reached out, her hand trembling, and brushed Emma's hair back from her face. How did you do this?" she whispered. The child shook her head gently. "I didn't do it alone. Everyone did. All the love in this room did." The moment felt too big for words, too vast for reason. It wasn't about miracles anymore. It was about the power of hearts breaking open, of faith returning where it had been buried. Margaret took a shaky breath, tears falling freely now. "I can feel everything," she whispered. "The floor beneath me, the strength in my legs, even my heartbeat. I can feel alive." Her voice cracked, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered to Emma. "You gave me back my life." Emma smiled, her eyes shining with something ancient and pure. "No, Judge Lady," she said softly. "You gave it back to yourself." And when Margaret took her first trembling step, one single, perfect step, the entire courtroom broke into tears. Some fell to their knees. Others reached for strangers' hands. Because in that one impossible moment, every person there knew they had witnessed the day hope remembered how to walk. Some verdicts are written in books, others are written in light. The courtroom that once echoed with the cold language of law now shimmered with something far greater: awe. Judge Margaret Thornfield stood tall behind the bench, her legs trembling but strong, her tears glistening under the soft glow filtering through the high windows. For 3 years, she had lived in a world of limits. But now, each breath she took felt like a promise reborn. Every person in the room was standing, unable to remain seated after witnessing the impossible. The court reporter had forgotten her keys. The jury sat stunned and open-mouthed, and even the bailiffs, men carved from habit and discipline, stood weeping silently in disbelief. Margaret took one careful step forward, then another, her hands shaking as she steadied herself on the polished oak. The sound of her heels, soft but deliberate, echoed across the courtroom floor like a hymn. Every movement seemed to draw light around her, like the universe itself was bowing to the moment. Emma watched her with wide, tired eyes. Her small hands trembled from the effort it had taken to do what no one believed was possible. And then, as the glow of the miracle faded, her little body wavered. "Emma!" Thomas cried out, rushing forward, catching his daughter just as she began to slump. He fell to his knees, holding her small frame against his chest, panic rising in his throat. "Baby, no. Stay with me, sweetheart." But Emma was smiling, her cheek pressed against his heart. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered weakly. "I'm just sleepy." Thomas's tears fell into her golden curls. "You did so good, baby. You did so good." The courtroom was silent again, but this time the quiet wasn't disbelief. It was reverence. People bowed their heads, praying, whispering, weeping. District Attorney Robert Hayes, the man who had built his career on certainty, law, and logic, stood rooted to the floor. His voice broke the silence, hoarse and trembling. This changes everything." No one argued. No one could. He looked at Margaret, standing, alive, radiant. "I've spent 25 years believing justice was something you could prove," he said quietly. "But after today, I don't know if I've ever really understood it." Margaret's voice was soft, but it carried with a strength that silenced even the sobs. "Justice," she said slowly, her eyes resting on the father and daughter before her, "was never meant to live only in books or laws. It was meant to live in us, in love, in mercy, in faith." She turned toward Hayes, her voice steadier now. "Law can define what's right, but love can heal what law cannot." Those words seemed to ripple through the air like a benediction. Emma stirred faintly in her father's arms, her small fingers brushing against his face. "See, Daddy?" she murmured softly, half asleep. "Told you magic's real." Thomas choked out a laugh that broke halfway into a sob. "Yeah, baby. Yeah, you did." Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward from the back, his medical training colliding with his faith in the face of something he couldn't explain. "Judge Thornfield," he said, his voice filled with awe, "what happened to you defies every law of medicine." Margaret turned toward him, her tears glistening like light. "Then maybe," she said gently, "we've been reading the wrong laws." The courtroom erupted again, not in chaos, but in applause, in tears, in the kind of raw, human sound that only truth can summon. Margaret took another step forward, this time unaided, her gaze fixed on the man at the defense table, Thomas Mitchell, the father who had broken the law to save his child's life, the man whose love had brought them all to this impossible, beautiful place. He looked up at her, his face streaked with tears. "Your Honor," he began, his voice trembling. "I don't know what happens now. I just know I'd do it all again if it meant saving her." Margaret's lips curved into a trembling smile. "I know you would," she said softly. "And that's what makes this so simple. And so hard." She turned back to face the courtroom, her robe flowing around her like a mantle of light. "This case," she said, her voice now steady and commanding, "has reminded us that love can drive both our greatest mistakes and our greatest miracles. The question before this court is not whether a law was broken, but whether the law should ever stand above love." The entire room hung on her every word. She took a breath, closing her eyes briefly, as though listening to something greater than herself. When she spoke again, her voice was clear and sure. "Love may not fit neatly into our codes and statutes," she said, "but today it has rewritten them all." Every person in the room knew what was coming, but no one dared to exhale until they heard it. Margaret turned to Thomas, her eyes shining with compassion and conviction. "Thomas Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom like a prayer, "the law demands punishment, but my heart demands mercy." The room went utterly silent. Every soul waited for the final question that hung in the air, like lightning waiting to strike. Would she free the man who started it all? The world held its breath as the judge prepared to speak. For a long, trembling moment, no one in courtroom 7 dared to move. The light pouring through the high windows seemed to pause in the air, wrapping everything in a stillness that felt sacred. Thomas Mitchell sat at the defense table, his arms around Emma, who lay drowsy but smiling in his lap. His heart thudded so loudly it drowned out the hum of the heating vents and the scratching of pens that had long since fallen silent. Judge Margaret Thornfield stood, her robe swaying softly, her hands steady against the bench. Every eye in the room watched her. The woman who had just performed the impossible. The woman who had risen from her wheelchair not by science or medicine, but by faith, love, and the courage of a little girl who believed more deeply than anyone else in the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was both steady and trembling, the voice of a woman who had just been remade. "This courtroom," she began softly, "was built to hold the weight of law, but today it held something heavier. It held the weight of love." Her gaze swept across the room, the jurors wiping their faces, the court officers standing at attention as if afraid to break the fragile holiness of the moment. "We've spent years writing laws meant to define what's right and what's wrong. But sometimes," she continued, "the truth doesn't fit between the lines. Sometimes compassion must speak where the law falls silent." Her words carried a power that reached beyond the courtroom walls. "Thomas Mitchell," she said, turning her gaze to the man who sat shaking in disbelief, "you broke a law, but you did it to save the most precious thing a person can have, the life of your child. You did not act from greed or anger or malice. You acted from love. And love," she said, her voice cracking just slightly, "is not a crime." The prosecutor, Robert Hayes, who had fought his entire career to uphold the letter of the law, stood slowly. His lips parted, but no words came. After a long silence, he lowered his head. "Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice trembling with something new, humility. "The state withdraws its case." A murmur swept through the crowd, a collective exhale of disbelief and awe. Hayes looked up at Margaret, his eyes red. "Maybe it's time," he whispered. "We remember that justice and mercy are supposed to walk hand in hand." Margaret nodded softly, tears glistening in her green eyes. She stepped down from the bench, the place where power lived, and walked toward the defendant's table, her robe whispering against the polished floor. The sight alone, the judge who had been confined to a wheelchair now walking freely across her courtroom, was enough to make hardened officers weep. But what she did next silenced even the angels. She knelt, right there, On the floor before Emma Mitchell, Judge Margaret Thornfield, the woman who had once ruled with distance and formality, knelt down as if before something holy. It wasn't weakness. It was reverence. It was the acknowledgement that miracles didn't always come from heaven. Sometimes they wore pigtails and carried teddy bears. Emma blinked sleepily, her small hand reaching up to touch the judge's cheek. "You did it," she whispered softly. "You stood up." Margaret smiled through tears. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. "You made me remember how." Then she rose again, turning to face the courtroom with renewed strength, the kind of strength that comes only after the soul has been remade. "Thomas Mitchell," she said clearly, "you stand accused of armed robbery. But this court has seen something greater than a crime today. We have seen proof that love can make miracles, and that sometimes love breaks laws to keep hearts whole." Her voice grew steady, commanding. "I find the defendant not guilty, by reason of parental love and extraordinary circumstance." The words hit like thunder. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. And then it shattered into sound. The entire courtroom erupted. Cheers, sobs, applause, the sound of hearts finally exhaling after holding too much for too long. Thomas dropped his face into his hands, overcome, and Sarah Mitchell clung to him from behind, crying like a woman who had seen resurrection. The young defense attorney, David Chen, looked skyward, his disbelief melting into laughter. Even Hayes, the unshakable prosecutor, found himself clapping through tears he didn't bother to hide. Margaret lifted the gavel, her symbol of law, and brought it down one final time. Bang. "This case," she said softly, "is closed. This family is free." The applause turned into something like a prayer, the sound of redemption itself. Thomas stood, lifting Emma into his arms, holding her as if he would never let her go again. The child wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, whispering something only he could hear, and he smiled through tears that refused to stop. But as the noise filled the courtroom, as joy spilled into every corner, Margaret raised a trembling hand. "Emma," she called softly, her voice carrying warmth and wonder. The little girl turned, her head resting on her father's shoulder. "Come back here for a moment," the judge said. "There's something I still need to say." The crowd quieted instantly, anticipation thick as the air. The miracle had ended, but somehow everyone knew. The most important moment hadn't happened yet. Some miracles end in silence. This one became the start of something bigger. It had been 3 months since the day courtroom 7 became holy ground, the day when logic bowed to love, when justice found its heart again. Winter had melted into the gentler air of spring, and yet for those who had been there, that December morning still glowed in memory like a lantern that refused to dim. Judge Margaret Thornfield stood before her mirror that morning, fastening the silver clasp of her black robe, the same robe that had once felt heavy with duty, now light with purpose. There was no wheelchair behind her anymore, just sunlight streaming through the curtains, and the faint scent of rose oil drifting from the small vase on her desk. A gift from a little girl who'd changed everything. When she stepped into courtroom 7, heads turned, not out of pity, but reverence. She walked unassisted down the aisle, each step graceful and strong. The familiar click of her heels on marble echoed like a song of resurrection. The bailiff, the same one who had called, "All rise," when she could not, smiled through tears as he spoke the words again. This time, they felt whole. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Thornfield." Everyone stood. Margaret smiled as she took her place behind the bench, running her hand along the polished wood. She had touched this surface countless times before, but now it felt alive, as if it carried a heartbeat of its own. Maybe it did. Maybe that courtroom had learned to breathe again, just like she had. Her docket was full, as always. Petty thefts, family disputes, the endless grind of humanity trying to find balance between mistake and redemption. But something in her rulings had changed. Her tone was softer, Her eyes lingered longer on faces. She no longer saw cases. She saw stories, hearts, fears, and the kind of love that made people break rules to survive. The newspapers had called her the walking judge, the miracle woman whose paralysis had vanished mid-trial. But she knew the truth. What had healed her wasn't the impossible. It was the rediscovery of faith, the return of belief, the power of a child's love that refused to let the world stay ordinary. After that day, Thomas Mitchell had rebuilt his life, piece by piece. The same community that once whispered behind his back now offered him work, meals, and gratitude. He'd taken a maintenance position with Michael Peterson, the pharmacist who once testified against him. And together, they'd started a program to help low-income families afford medicine. No child should suffer because of a dollar sign, Thomas said the day they hung the new sign, the Mitchell Fund for Compassionate Care. Emma became something of a quiet legend in town. People didn't talk about her gift openly, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Those who experienced it spoke in whispers. A neighbor whose arthritis had faded after Emma hugged her goodbye. A stray dog found limping one day, running the next after the little girl knelt beside it. But Emma never boasted. She never claimed to be special. When asked about her magic, she only smiled and said, "It's not magic. It's just love that remembers what it can do." Margaret often saw the Mitchells. Sometimes they visited the courthouse, sometimes she visited them. They had become family in a way the law could never define, bound by something deeper than verdicts or signatures. On a bright afternoon in May, Margaret sat in her chambers reviewing files when she heard the familiar sound of small footsteps running down the hall. The door burst open, and there she was, 5-year-old Emma Mitchell, curls bouncing, cheeks flushed with life. "Judge Lady," she called joyfully, holding something behind her back. Margaret laughed, setting down her pen. "Emma, I wasn't expecting you today. What brings my favorite miracle worker to court?" Emma grinned, walking up to her desk. "I brought you something," she said, pulling out a small clay pot. Inside it was a young rose bush, its leaves green, its single bud tightly furled but glowing faintly pink at the edges. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes softening. "It's beautiful." "I grew it myself," Emma said proudly. "But not the normal way. The love way." Margaret smiled, tracing her fingers along the delicate stem. "The love way?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Grammy says love makes everything grow faster. Plants, people, even hearts that got scared." She paused, thinking deeply. "You were scared before, weren't you, Judge Lady?" Margaret's breath caught. The truth was simple, undeniable. "Yes," she said softly. "I was scared of hoping again." "But you're not scared anymore," Emma said matter-of-factly, "because you remembered that love is stronger than rules." Margaret swallowed hard, blinking back sudden tears. "I did remember," she whispered, "and I'll never forget again." Just then, Thomas appeared in the doorway, older now, but lighter, his limp barely noticeable. He smiled at the sight of the two of them together. "I told her not to barge in," he said sheepishly. Margaret shook her head. "She's always welcome." Thomas's eyes softened with gratitude. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you did that day," he said quietly. Margaret rose and walked around her desk, her steps firm and steady. "No, Thomas," she said gently. "It's me who should thank you, and her. You both reminded me why I took this oath in the first place. Justice without compassion isn't justice at all." He nodded, emotion tightening his throat. Emma looked up at the two adults, her blue eyes full of wonder. "It's like Daddy says," she added softly. "When love and rules fight, love should win." Margaret knelt down beside her, meeting the child's gaze at eye level. "Then you'll make a better judge than me one day." Emma giggled and handed her the rose. "You can keep it in your office, so you never forget." Margaret took the small pot in her hands, as though it were something sacred. The petals quivered under the sunlight streaming through the window, slowly beginning to open. She placed it on her desk, right beside the gavel. One symbol of law, one symbol of love. And for the first time, she understood that both belonged there, side by side. Through the window, laughter floated up from the courthouse square, the sound of children playing, of life moving forward. Margaret smiled, feeling the ache of gratitude fill her chest. It wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to all of them, to everyone who had ever chosen love over fear, compassion over rules, hope over despair. Emma tugged at her sleeve. "Judge Lady," she said softly, "do you know what I think?" "What's that, sweetheart?" Emma's smile was pure sunlight. "I think the world just needed someone to remember." Margaret's eyes glistened as she whispered, "And you helped us do that." Emma looked at the rose on the desk, now beginning to bloom. "See?" she said proudly. "Love fixed it." Margaret smiled, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Emma," she whispered. "Love fixed everything that was broken and made it beautiful again." If this story reminded you that love can heal what logic can't, share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might inspire someone who's lost faith in miracles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because every week we bring you stories that prove hope is never gone.